So we have begun our review of the last group of group number 3 of the the uh, the third group of the apostles, the one that starts with James, the son of Alphaeus, Lebbaeus, surnamed Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot. And we're looking at these guys. These are kind of obscure guys, but we're realizing that they're used in a mighty way by God, and so they're due our study. So we just, remember last week we looked at James, the Mikros, little James. We thought he was young, small, and in less in stature than the other James, and that's why they called him Mikros. So let's continue. Matthew 10, verse 3. Okay? Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus. All right? Does everybody have the same thing? Huh? If you look in Acts 6:16 or Luke 6:16, Acts 1:13, you don't have to look them up, but you'll find a third name. He has a third name. Do you know what it is? Judas, son of James. So he goes by Lebbaeus, Thaddeus, and Judas, the son of James. And one place he's called Judas, not Iscariot. And Judas is a very common name at the time. It means Jehovah leads. And many people at that time named their son Jehovah leads, Judas. So this is his given name by his parents probably was Judas. And then, like a lot of people, he received some other names as he went through life. One of those Lebbaeus, the other Thaddeus, kind of like nicknames. Thaddeus is an interesting word. In the Hebrew, the root word is thad, which means it has to do with the female breast. No, this isn't obscene. It has to do with the youngest child in the family. And if it was a boy, oftentimes they would refer to that boy as Thaddeus, the baby of his family. He was probably a member of a large family. He was the last boy, and they nicknamed him Thaddeus. Have you ever met a proud mother who introduces you to her baby? And the guy walks up and he's 6'5" and weighs 240 pounds? Yeah, kind of the same idea. Huh? That's Anita? Miles? Oh, okay. That's her baby? Junior, yeah. The baby of the family is Thaddeus, and kind of a figure of speech. And they also called him Lebbaeus, and Lebbaeus is probably a nickname, and it comes from the Hebrew root leb, and that means heart. Leb means heart in Hebrew, so it would mean that he's a heart child. And a heart child is someone, that would be a name that would characterize somebody that had a lot of courage. So he was the baby of the family. These appear to be his nicknames. Lebbaeus, reflecting courage. Thaddeus, the baby, the youngest one. Judas is probably the name he was given at birth, Judas. So, from his mother's perspective, he may have been a tender boy. From his friend's perspective, he may have been a man of courage, but he's wrapped in obscurity too. He's not in the who's who of Judea, but he does ask one question in Scripture. Look at John 14 if you have your Bibles. Jesus is speaking. It's the night before his trial, and he says in verse 21, John 14:21, he says, "He that has my commandments and keeps them, it is he that loves me. He that loves me shall be loved of my Father, and I'll love him, and I'll manifest myself to him." Incredible statement there if you think about it. You could sit there and pull that thing apart if you wanted to and probably spend a couple hours on it. But basically, what it says is, if you keep my commandments, you show that you love me. All right? I can tell who loves me because they obey me. You can claim to love God, you can claim to love Christ, but if you don't obey, your claim is a lie. And by that I mean, when I use the word obey, you have to have an obedient life. You're not going to obey all the time. The idea is, are you trying? But he that keeps the commandments is the one that loves me. Those are Jesus' words. And the one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him, and I'll manifest myself to him. So that's an important statement. The next one is even more important. God can only be manifest to the heart that loves him. God can only be manifest to a heart that loves him. That's the reason why people in the world don't know God. That's the reason why they can't perceive the truth, because they don't love God. There has to be a love towards God, a willingness to obey, and then God can be manifested in a person's life. The point being, the sum of it is, God is only manifest to a loving heart. Think about when you came to know Christ. When you made a decision to love him, that's when he was manifested in your life. Okay? Only to those that love him is he manifest. Now that word manifest, for Judas, Lebbeus, Thaddeus, whatever you want to call him, he responds to that word that Jesus uses there in verse 21. And in verse 22, Judas, it says, Judas said to him, not Iscariot, okay? This is Judas, the son of James. It says, Lord, now, he says, Lord, is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? Listen to the question. Judas says, Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? It's as if he is saying, you're only saying that those who love you are going to see you and know you, and you will be manifest only to those that love you? And how can you manifest yourself to us and not to the world? Judas, Lebbeus, Thaddeus is trying to figure out what Jesus is explaining. So part of the problem is that he's thinking of the manifestation of Jesus Christ as a physical manifestation, or in your outline the word would be outward. He's thinking of the manifestation of Christ as an outward one. You see, this man, like most of the apostles, did his thinking when God spoke about the king. When Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God, what were they thinking? Right, an earthly kingdom. They were thinking, you're going to overthrow Rome, and you're going to establish an earthly kingdom. And he's saying to him, if that's what he's thinking, how could you fulfill what we know of the Messiah, the hope we have for a Messiah? How could you set up a kingdom on earth without people knowing who you are, without you demonstrating who you are, okay? How can you occupy the throne of David, if and you can say, and you're saying that you're not going to manifest yourself to everyone because the world will see who you are. How could you do that? How could it be done in such a way that they wouldn't see who you are? Okay? So that's one way to read his question. Can you think of another way you might read that question? Yeah, and that's the other way. Why are you manifesting? Why are you why would you think of only manifesting yourself to us and only to us, not to other people? Okay? Because who are the apostles? Well, they're just a group of guys. I mean, if you're the Messiah, and this is the moment of the Messiah, why would you only show yourself to us? It's a world, the Messiah is coming to rule the world, so why won't everybody see you? I mean, if it's time for the kingdom, let's go ahead and get the kingdom going, and you might see a little bit. Maybe that's why he's called. Why there's a correlation in one of his nicknames for being courageous, because he asked this kind of question. But he wants to know. He's asking Jesus, why are you only manifesting yourself in this way? And what does Jesus say? So how does Jesus then respond after his question? If a man love me, and he'll keep my words, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him. So what he says the same thing again. He just repeats it in a different way. And the point is this: Judas, Lebbeus, Thaddeus, whatever name you prefer, the only people that will perceive Christ are the ones who love Christ. Does it know what he says? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? And what's he say in verse 24? He says, he that loves me not keeps not my sayings, and the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me. In other words, the only one who doesn't love me doesn't know what I'm talking about and doesn't know it came from God. So what Jesus is saying, to put it in simpler terms, is his manifestation is limited to believers. How about we'll use reception? His manifestation is limited to reception. It's like a radio station. John, you used to work at a radio station, right? You can send the signal out, but until somebody turns on their radio, they can't receive your signal. They have to be open to receiving it. Robert Louis Stevenson said this quote. He quoted Thoreau as saying this: it takes two people to speak the truth, the one who says it and the one who hears it. Okay? And it's true. Christ came unto his own, but his own, remember what it says? His own received him not. Christ came to the world. The world was made by Christ, but the world didn't know who he was. The God of this world, Satan, blinded their minds. Light came into the world, but men loved darkness. And the reason why they loved darkness is because their receivers weren't on. And Jesus is saying here, I can only manifest myself to people who will receive what I'm saying, who will receive with their hearts what I'm trying to show them. So I'm kind of glad that Judas asked this question, because there's a lot of truth in those couple verses where Jesus is teaching. But he's a guy, evidently he's a thoughtful guy, he's a reflectful guy. He thinks of the typical Jewish kingdom on earth. He's not thinking of a heavenly kingdom. And that's what the Jews believed, and he couldn't figure out how you could bring it about without everybody knowing about it. And I think he reflects, There's a sense of humility with him, you know. Why would you tell it to us as apostles, and not tell the whole world? Why would you limit it just to us? So you can see things in him that are admirable. You know, one writer said that you could take a Charles Wesley hymn. Most of you know Wesley, some of his hymn. You could pull that page out of a hymnal, crumple it up and throw it out in the street and just let it sit there. And a dog might come by and sniff it, but it wouldn't mean anything to the dog, okay? And maybe the garbage guy would come along and pick it up and throw it in the trash. To him it would be trash. Or maybe a recycler would run up and grab it and take it home and throw it in their recycle bag. Or maybe somebody in the world might come along who was materialistic, and they'd pick it up thinking, well, maybe it's a blank check or something. Or maybe a person of literature might pick it up and say, oh, Charles Wesley, he was such a good writer, a great poet. But then there might be somebody who came along that was spiritually minded, who picked it up and might be blessed by it. See, the paper is one thing, okay? But it's how you receive the paper that's the issue. That's how it is in the world too. Only those hearts that are purified by love and walk in obedience will know the manifestation of God. We don't understand how that all works, but that's the way it works. I think that's and that's the kind of person Thaddeus was. So we see the Lord uses, we've looked at James, an obscure person like James, people that are hardly even mentioned in the scripture, the son of Alphaeus. We've looked at Thaddeus, Lebbeus, Judas, whatever name you want to call them by. They're not famous people beyond being apostles, but each one of them will rule a tribe of Judah in heaven. Tradition tells us that Thaddeus was gifted in one particular way greatly. He was gifted with the power of God to heal the sick. And tradition says that there was a Syrian king by the name of Abgar who heard about the healing of Thaddeus, and because he was ill, he called for Thaddeus to come to Syria and to heal him. And on the way, they say there were multitudes along the road that as he walked along were healed as he went his way to Syria. And when he finally reached the king, he healed the king. And he presented the gospel to the king. And tradition says the king became a Christian. But when he became a Christian, his country fell into chaos. Okay? And he had a nephew who took Thaddeus and made him a prisoner and then killed him in Syria. And if you ever look, each one of the apostles has a symbol. Okay? They all have symbols. The early church gave them symbols that apply to their lives. And Thaddeus' symbol is a club, a great big club. And the reason why he has that for a symbol is because supposedly that's the way he died. He was beat to death with a great big club. Faithful to the Lord. All right? Okay, Simon. Simon the Zealot. Okay. Does anybody have a different word besides zealot? Matthew 10, verse 3. Zealot. Some will say Canaanite, but that's a poor translation. That's a transliteration of a different word. Zealot is a better translation. Zealot comes from a root word, quana, and it means to be jealous or to be zealous for the law, to be jealous for the law, or to be zealous for the law. And in Luke, not in Matthew, but in Luke, he is called Simon the Zealot. The Zelotes is the way you say it in Greek. And it means the same thing. Simon, the man full of zeal, the zealot. And he might have actually been identified at that time in history. There was a group of people known as the Zealots. There was a group in Judaism known as the Zealots, and maybe he was a disciple of that group. And when he joined the apostles, they didn't change his name. He may have continued. The Zealots were they were very dedicated people. So he may have brought that passion with him when he became an apostle. Now in Judaism, there's 4 groups as far as the religious beliefs, if you want to say it that way. There's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, okay? Those are the leader groups. There's the Essenes. Do you know who the Essenes are? Those are the dudes that hung out in the desert. They were kind of like the hippies. They were mystics. They believed in, they were the ones that started some of the ideas behind monastic living, monastery living. They believed in depriving themselves of certain things. They believed in outer body experiences. That's the Essenes. And then the last group were the Zealots. And the Zealots were political people. And the Zealots, for lack of a better term, were terrorists. They were practitioners of guerrilla warfare. And they went around at this time in history and gave the Romans a hard time. They would steal, burn, they would murder Romans if they found them on the road and were able to overpower them. There was a group of them that were known as assassins, okay? And they revolted against Roman domination. And they had been born out of the Old Testament during the Maccabean period. So they go all the way back to Judas Maccabeus, who revolted. Judas Maccabeus, do you know who he revolted against? In the Old Testament, he revolted against the Greeks, okay, way back. So these are revolutionaries that have revolution in their blood for decades, centuries. The book First Maccabeus speaks to about these guys. And it seems that even during this time, there's this politically oriented terrorist group, for lack of a better name, called the Zealots. And in the New Testament, they had a leader by the name of Judas, okay? Once again, a very common name of the time. And under the leading of this Judas, he was called Judas of Galilee, they began increasing their seditious acts in an attempt to drive the Romans from their lands. And these are really interesting people. They're very, very, very passionate. And if you were reading your New Testament, if you knew the history of like if you had a daily newspaper during this time in the New Testament, you would almost every day you would read something in the paper about the Zealots. The Zealots attacked the Romans here. The Zealots burned down this house because they saw the owner talking to a Roman. The Zealots robbed this guy. The Zealots did that. They would go out and loot, murder, plunder. There was nothing that was too low for them. They were like guerrilla warfare fighters. And at the time that we're looking at now in history, who's the ruler of the Jewish land? Yeah, Herod, who is right, in his nationality he is, no, he's a Idumean. He is a descendant of Edom. And who was the first Edomite? Yeah. He was the Edomites are descendants of Esau, and they're called Idumeans. So Israel at this time, when Jesus was born, like Gordy said, was not led by a Jew. They were led by Herod the Great. And Herod the Great was an Edomite. And then when Herod died, and these guys, they were always killing each other, you know. They were a lot of political intrigue. When he died, he divided his territory in 3 pieces, and he gave them to his 3 sons. One of them was named Philip, who took the northwest part, Antipas, who took Galilee, and then he had one other son. His name was Archelaus. And Archelaus took the part in Judea and Samaria. But the problem with Archelaus was he's a loser. He was a very poor ruler, and he was victimized by the Zealots. So the Romans replaced him, and they replaced him with a guy by the name of Pilate. That's how Pilate ends up on the picture. But there's all this, during this time in Israel, there's all of this political unrest and all this shifting and moving and struggling powers. And the Zealots are getting stronger and stronger under the leadership of this guy named Judas of Galilee. And finally, the Romans killed Judas, but the Zealots still continue, and they go on, and Josephus, who's a famous historian of the time, says that these Jews believed that they were fighting a holy war. Who believes they're fighting a holy war now? The Arabs, a jihad. But these guys would go around looting and burning and whatever they could do to cause trouble. And maybe Simon had been a member of that group. He's called Simon the Zealot. Maybe he had been engaged in that kind of activity. But these guys, like I alluded to earlier, these guys were so anti-Roman, they would kill any Roman they could. But if they caught you, if you were a Jew and they caught you talking to a Roman, they would kill you too. That's how much they hated Romans. They would assassinate anybody that had anything to do with the Romans. And finally, in 70 AD, the Romans had enough of the Zealots. And Josephus says, in his book, The Antiquities, he says that's why Rome destroyed the city of Jerusalem, to get rid of the Zealots. All right? The Romans got tired of messing around with them and chasing them all over the place. So they decided we're going to go in and wipe out the Jews. And they pretty much did. You know that they burned to the ground over 980 towns on their way to Jerusalem. And then they sieged Jerusalem, and they ultimately burned Jerusalem to the ground. And but even after that, there were still some zealots left that had escaped. And they continued to fight. And they had a leader after 70 A.D. His name was Eleazar. And Eleazar continued to lead the zealots in their terror campaign, even though there was only a few of them. But they ended up, I mentioned this because I know you know where they went. They ended up finding a place that they could retreat to so the Romans couldn't get them. And they went to Masada. Do you know? They went to Masada. And from there, they would attack, and it was hard for the Romans to mess with them because they could mess with the Romans from Masada. And I think that Masada was built by Herod, I think. And of course, that's after the time of Simon, after the time of Jesus. But do you know what happened at Masada? The Romans finally brought enough guys to take the You know, Masada's on a flat hilltop. It's pretty, it's an impressive fortification. And the Zealots so hated and so despised the Romans that they would not allow themselves to be captured by them. So again, Josephus writes in his book, The War of the Jews, that Eleazar gave a fiery speech to all the people in Masada, and he told them, don't let the Romans take you. Kill your wives and your children, and then kill yourselves. And you know what they did? They killed their wives, their children, and then they killed themselves. Over 900 people all died at one time. They said there was 2 women and 5 children who had escaped by hiding in a cave. But, so when you consider that mindset, these aren't your normal Jewish people. These are radical thinkers. These are what we would call today political terrorists. These are the kind of people that blow themselves up for their faith. Okay, they would rather kill themselves than they would let a Roman kill them. That's the way they felt. They hated them so much. So you have this guy called Simon the Zealot who attaches himself to Jesus as an apostle. So he must have been, if they still calling him the Zealot, he must have been a man of great passion, a man of great zeal. And you can imagine he must have been a fireball working for the Lord. You know, if you're that passionate, he had found a better leader than he ever had before. So, and he's always listed the same way. He's always listed right before who? Judas Iscariot. So you know what that probably means? They probably went out together all the time. And you know, Judas Iscariot was very politically motivated. And we're going to look at quite a bit at Judas in the next couple weeks. But Judas, one of the reasons that he was drawn to Jesus is because he thought Jesus was going to overthrow the Romans. And that was what Judas really wanted initially. Okay? So Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot may have had some common political orientation. They may have come from the same cloth, kind of say, you know, on the same level. And they may have thought Jesus can really aid us. But the difference would be, was that Simon could have ended up like Judas. He could have been a betrayer. Then you would never call your kid Simon. You know, how many people name their kids Judas? Yeah, not unless you don't like them. But Simon could have ended up like Judas. But Simon ended up evidently believing and being transformed by Christ. And so the name Simon's still okay these days. But Simon became evidently Christ man. It must have been, now can you imagine, here's Simon the Zealot. Can you imagine Simon the Zealot and Matthew, the Roman tax collector, together? That's quite a thought, the two of them in the same group. They may,
In the first 2 groups there's record of Jesus calling them with them following Jesus.
yeah,
In the last group there, I don't know if there was any record of how Jesus picked them.
no. And you know, that's that idea behind, the first group is very intimate with Jesus. The second group is less intimate. And this last group,
So where did they come from?
yeah, they were,
Did
but
they come to follow Jesus, or did Jesus follow them?
I don't know. You know, it's kind of and we even see with even the main group, it's a combination. You know, it's a calling and it's a seeking, because we know Christ seeks us. But Simon, and I wonder if Matthew sometimes slept with one eye open watching Simon, because he might have been worried about him. But we've looked in this study, we've seen how the Lord uses all these unqualified people, just like he can use me and you. Okay? Here's another illustration. There was a concert violinist who wanted to demonstrate, you've probably heard this story. He wanted to make a very important point. So he was in a great city in Europe, and he hired a large hall, and he announced that he was going to play a concert on his $50,000 violin. And all these violin aficionados came to the concert, and he played exquisitely, and they applauded him and, yelled bravo and all that stuff, and he took a bow, and he took in their applause, and then he took his violin and he threw it on the ground and he stomped it into little bits. And the people were horrified. And then he walked off the stage, and as the people were yelling and screaming, his stage manager came out and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, to put you at ease, that violin was a $50 violin, not a $50,000 violin. Now the maestro will play his $50,000 violin." And you know what? He got up and played it, and they couldn't tell the difference. And that was his point. See, it's not the instrument that matters. It's the artist that matters. It's him that matters. And really, let's face it, most of us are $50 violins. I may not even be a $50 violin, okay? But what music the master can make when he uses us in the way he wants to. All right? We'll close here in a couple minutes. 11 disciples. We've looked at 11 disciples. And we've learned just about everything we can about those 11. Some of them, we had a lot of information. Some of them, we had very little or even no information. We've tried to figure out their personalities, their characters. We've looked at what their names might tell us. We've looked at how they fit into the schemes of things, how into the Lord's plan, why they were selected, and we've even looked at some of the tasks they were given, how they were intrinsically prepared for the task even before they knew they had the task. And the one thing that I think we can conclude in general is that all these guys basically were unqualified. Basically, they were just common people like me and you. These were men that God had to transform in order for them to God had to mold them in order to make them into what he wanted them to be. And we saw how the Lord overcame their unqualifications and made them qualifications, and how he enabled them to teach and preach and to heal and cast out demons as the representatives of his kingdom. And were these guys successful? Very successful. They were really the key to all the rest of human history up to this point. If they had failed, what would have happened? That's right. There would have not been another generation. But they're a living testimony to the success of the 11, and they did it under the energy of the Spirit of God. They were able to do it, and they brought about that which Christ asked them to do. They built his church. But there's one left, and that's the 12th. And he stands out against the background of all the others. He would seem to be isolated. He would seem to be a lonely person. He would seem to be, in some ways, a social misfit. And his name is Judas Iscariot. And he's the epitome, if you will, of disaster. He's the vilest, most wicked man in the entire Bible. He is listed last in every list of the apostles, and he's always listed last. And there's always a comment about him when he's listed about his betrayal, because that was his brand. He was branded with that, and he will be branded for all time. The dark story of Jesus is a blight on the page of human history. And I'm sorry, yeah, I said Judas. The blight of the dark story of Judas is a blight on the page of human history. And although there is quite a bit we know about him, there's still some mystery and some darkness that surrounds him. And some of those things we will never know. But his word means, if you call somebody, if you say, you're a Judas, you're a betrayer, you're a deceiver. What happens if you call him, you're a Steve, or you're a John, or you're a Gordy, you know. But if you say somebody's a Judas, that's different. Amen. Amen. Yep. His name is despised, and it's not really used much as a name anymore in society. Although remember what Judas means? Jehovah leads. That's what the name means. There are 40 verses in the New Testament in which there's a reference to the betrayal of Jesus Christ. And in each of them, there's the implication of the incredible sin of the man named Judas. How many of you are familiar with Dante? Dante's Inferno. In Dante's Inferno, there's a passage where Judas is depicted occupying the lowest level of hell, the one designed for Lucifer himself. And Judas is never allowed to rise. In Dante's Inferno, there's all these caverns, different levels of punishment in hell. And Judas is never allowed to leave that lowest level. He's never allowed to have any contact with anyone. He's so deep in the pit. Okay? So after the mention of his death, and after his mention, I think it's Acts 1:16, Judas disappears from the scriptures, never mentioned again. But I believe Judas can teach us some profound and some awakening lessons. So that's where we're going to start next week. We will start with Judas Iscariot. Questions? Why is he most despicable? Yeah, but there's a different level of evil involved here. It's just like, it's like the idea with a little old lady who lived next door to you that used to bring you cookies every Saturday morning, but never knew Jesus Christ. Will she receive the same punishment as Adolf Hitler in hell? No. And Judas is a despicable man because of the sin that he committed. Because it was his sin that put Jesus Christ in the position that he was in. Now, if it hadn't been Judas, would it have been somebody else? Yes. But it was, the scripture had to be fulfilled. But it was Judas. What word would you use to characterize him? And would they not be despicable? Yeah. Well, he was the instrument by which the Son of God was killed. That would put him, in my mind, as most. Who would have done it? I hope not. Yeah. We're going to look at him for a couple weeks. Huh? Yeah, well, he was definitely had a guilty conscience. Yeah. I think he's a special sinner. Is anybody else? You ever see that movie? Despicable Me? Yeah, with the minions. Yeah, Tiffy loves